Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the plenary discussion on digital governance. As part of the new normal, even pre-pandemic, companies were already jumping on the digital bandwagon, not just to engage with customers and external stakeholders, but even internally between teams and development functions. A well-designed and agile digital governance framework will enable companies to harness the efficiencies and benefits of technology to their advantage, but it is not without its challenges. My name is Sumei Wong, the APAC Data Protection Officer for LexisNexis Legal and Professional, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. Joining us today are our two panelists, Mr. Dominic Y, who is partner at ONC Lawyers, and Mr. Chen Guang Lam, Associate at Clyde & Co Singapore, to share with us their expertise and experience on the subject. Let me start with a quick introduction of our esteemed panelists, beginning with Mr. Dominic Y. Before joining the legal profession, Dominic worked in the banking sector as well as in the Independent Commission Against Corruption, or ICAC. Dominic's practice focuses on advising clients on matters relating to anti-corruption, white-collar crime, law enforcement, regulatory and compliance matters in Hong Kong, including advice on anti-money laundering. He also handles cases involving corporate litigation, shareholders' disputes and insolvency matters, defamation cases, domestic and international arbitration cases, cybersecurity, data security and privacy law issues, competition law matters, e-discovery, and forensic investigation issues, as well as property litigation. Dominic is currently a board member of a charity that provides a home service for sick children and their families. He is supportive and actively participating in the activities of the charity. Mr. Chen Guang Lam is an associate with the Singapore team of Clyde & Co. His practice focuses primarily on matters pertaining to technology, data protection, and fintech. He regularly advises clients on transactional projects such as technology outsourcing and procurement, and advisory matters focusing on data protection, technology risk management, and cybersecurity. Chen Guang is a Singapore qualified lawyer and holds the Certified Information Privacy Professional Asia, CIPPA, and the Certified Information Privacy Professional Europe, CIPPE, Data Protection Privacy Accreditation from the International Association of Privacy Professionals. He is also listed as a legal advisor under the Payment Regulatory Evaluation Program, an initiative that the Monetary Authority of Singapore to assist payment services providers. Thank you, Dominic and Chen Guang, for joining us today.
Hello.
For our audience members, if you have any questions that you would like to ask the panel, please submit them in the Q&A chat box for our panelists' consideration. So let's dive in and let's start a little by talking about the background against which businesses and companies are operating in. Now, the pandemic has caused a significant shift in the way we work, and that in turn has brought about heightened awareness about the importance of digital operational resilience. I think it will be interesting to hear our panelists' views on how the need for increased digital operational resilience has affected the way companies address technology risk management issues and concerns. Perhaps we could start with you first, Dominic.
Thank you, Sumei. Hello, Chen Guang, and good morning, everyone. I think even before the pandemic, there are companies, mainly international companies and including law firms, who have made arrangements for staff to work from home or remotely as a part of their flexible or agile work policy. And so when the pandemic comes, when everyone needs to, or even if not everyone, or for certain periods of time, people will need to work from home, particularly with those who are facing lockdowns in many other places. In Hong Kong, we might not need to do that much, but still, because of the policies of certain companies, then people are also suggested or recommended to work from home, at least when there are high number of cases. Now, that might not be something that would be familiar with some companies that I mentioned, because they already have that kind of flexible and agile policies. But for some smaller companies that they might not be prepared for that, suddenly they have a digital threat landscape exponentially increased. And in the past, maybe people would have some BYOD, bring your own device policies, but then that might just be for one device. And then suddenly you have the whole company staff using their own computers at home. So your threat landscape might be exponentially increased from one device to almost double or triple. And also all those devices, whether they are really suitable for this kind of measures. Now, people might find that they have to use their old computers at home and they need to buy some computers because their computers might be used by other family members who are also facing lockdowns, or their children who needs to go to school teaching through also virtually. So actually, I think throughout the pandemic, a lot of these issues caused cyber criminals to increase their ransomware attacks. And because in the past, companies might be very safe in a sense to be behind the firewall within the company. But now it's suddenly all the staff are out, maybe outside the firewall. So in the months that we have the pandemic, I think there have been really a lot of increase in phishing attacks and ransomware that affect a lot of corporations. Now in Hong Kong, I think the Privacy Commissioner also looked at that, and then they issued 3 guidance notes for companies, employees, and for users of video conferencing software. So I think this kind of risk also got the attention of regulators. And just to share with you a few points raised by the Privacy Commissioner in the guidance notes to organizations. Now, these kind of things might not be really new, but it's worth repeating in terms of like companies setting policies for staff to how to handle data during work from home arrangements. Now, whether they have been using public Wi-Fi's or whether their home Wi-Fi systems might be vulnerable for attacks, and how do they deal with communications via SMS and instant messages. These kind of things are something that are becoming the new normal, and then the companies, big or small, will need to deal with that. And so companies might not be familiar with this, but still with this new threat landscape increasing, I think all companies actually throughout the world would need to be prepared and also follow the guidance of the local regulators. I'll stop for the time being and see whether anyone has any other comments. Thank you.
Perhaps in the interim as well, we can hear Zhen Guang's thoughts and perspective from the Southeast Asia region.
Thanks, Sumei. Thanks, Dominic, as well. I thought that was very well explained. So here in Singapore, there is a recognition by businesses of the need for their operations to be pandemic resilient in the longer term, beyond COVID-19, in which remote work arrangements will play a huge role. So in Singapore, the default position is still to work from home. Some companies have already publicly announced their longer term plans to offer their staff remote or hybrid work arrangements in this new normal. So for me, what I see is that the remote working requires changes to policies and operational processes, some of which could lead to new risks and risk management challenges. Given that large-scale ongoing remote working will continue, the associated risks may only emerge over time. The forms that remote working will take and the resultant risks will also continue to evolve. So there are maybe some areas that I'd like to talk about regarding technology risk management concerns. The first area would involve information governance. To facilitate remote working, companies have governance policies to allow staff to access customer information and other sensitive information when they are working remotely. So previously, staff could only access such information within the office premises. But by doing so, to access customer information remotely, this heightens the inherent risk of leakage. So for example, staff surfing the internet through the ISP directly on corporate devices and therefore bypassing the corporate proxy and internet gateway. So companies must always constantly assess the risks and implications of information loss when determining which activities can be performed remotely. Companies must also strengthen preventive and detective controls to mitigate these risks. So for example, companies should disable VPN split tunneling and enable always-on VPN configuration. So these are some of the IT security that my firm or companies that I see are actually using right now. So the other area that I wanted to talk about was something that Dominic touched upon earlier, which is the management of IT assets. So in the new normal, companies may also have to supplement their existing IT infrastructure by deploying new hardware and software to enable effective large-scale remote working. So this includes new laptops, video communication tools, and other remote desktop applications to allow staff to actually access more systems or applications remotely. So sometimes we notice that these new hardware or software introduced may not integrate well with the existing systems, and that could affect the stability and security of the internal systems environment. So Dominic also touched upon the lost devices, how if in the wrong hands, they may allow cyber criminals to impersonate company staff to perhaps gain access to companies' critical systems and sensitive information. So some of the solutions I see is that the company must maintain sound and robust technology risk management practices to manage hardware and software deployed during this pandemic. So to conclude for my part is that these are the areas companies can focus on to improve their digital resilience in the remote working environment.
Thanks. I saw a very interesting question come in, and maybe I'll pose it to both the panelists. Are there any suggested approaches or solutions to deal with ransomware attacks other than just paying?
I think that is a very good question because it affects all companies around the world, including law firms, actually. And of course, if you have been a victim of ransomware, that's very difficult because all your data are locked. So unless you're able to have backups to try to get your data back for operation needs. So backing up is of course very important step that one needs to do it very diligently and try to segregate all this data where you have to be able to have a place where the backup would not be further hit by ransomware. And of course, not paying the ransom is a good idea because in terms of anti-money laundering issue, that might actually be an issue because you are paying the criminals. So you're in a way dealing with money that relates to a crime. But other than that, I think the education of the staff in terms of really being very diligent, vigilant in terms of not clicking into any embedded links or suspicious emails, that is very important. Because a lot of times this kind of attacks came in through that kind of a mode of communication. And if the staff are not careful, they might see an email that have been actually someone impersonating the boss, and then usually the sentence saying that it's urgent, please click on this and need you to work on this. And then if the person is not careful and just click on that, that might already be able to let the hackers come in with the ransomware app. And of course, then the other thing is more an IT thing. I think it's on monitoring what the staff have been accessing, what kind of website or links. So of course, I think there are software or apps or solutions that are able to detect that. So that might be something that companies can also consider. Zhengguan, what do you think?
So for me, I look at it in two ways. One is pre-incident and post-incidents. So these are the two perspectives I look at when dealing with such a situation. So I think, Dominic, you did talk a lot regarding some of the remedies or preventive measures that we can take pre-incident. Some of the things that I wanted to highlight as well is that you can have a very good documentation in place, but if it's not implemented, if your business units or the staff don't implement or don't practice what you have prepared, then it's all for naught. So I think training, culture, all these are something that plays a huge part in actually ensuring how you deal or how you prepare yourselves before such incidents even happen. So the other one I talk about is post-incident. So this is where people sit up and they realize, okay, what now? Something has happened. What do we do next? So this is where guidance is always looked upon to the legal counsels or the compliance because they are generally the first port of call when such an incident happens. So generally, I think that's where you need to make sure that the pre-incident documentations, for example, like a security breach management plan, these are already in place. If they're not in place, at least you ensure that there are certain steps that the staff or the affected individuals need to know or need to take so that you can actually deal with such consequences later on. And also, of course, post-incident consequences. As legal, we sometimes just look at it in a vacuum. But I think at the end of the day, we need to consider and appreciate the fact that there's also other considerations. So for example, let's talk about the ransomware attack example, whether to pay or not. I think this is something that is very dependent on the facts. Do we pay and then encourage such actions, or because of the current actual incidents that's happening right now, it might be better to pay off because commercially that is better in the long term. So I think at the end of the day, what is most important is to prepare yourself pre-incident. So preventive measures, putting in the necessary solutions and security measures. So this plays the most important part when dealing with such a situation.
Yeah, I also think that given it also really depends on the country that you're in at the moment. I see some legislators already talking about potentially criminalizing payment of ransomware attacks given the prevalence. So, I mean, this is definitely a space that we all are very keen and eager to, monitor the developments. I think our panelists' views will also change depending on the landscape. I appreciate that the panelists have actually nicely segued into another question that was posed in terms of the roles that lawyers play to help their clients deal with cybersecurity attacks. But I mean, drilling down to the heart of the issue, what do you think the client's expectations are of their lawyers in such instances when it comes to helping your respective clients deal with cybersecurity threats?
Well, maybe I'll go first. I think client might expect us to help them in terms of possible legal liability issues, because if the company has been a victim of ransomware attack, that actually shows that there might be some vulnerability in the system, which if the business partners or stakeholders know about that, they might lose confidence in the company, or they might actually even claim the company if there are certain agreements with the that particular victim company. And also depending on the industry, of course, if the victim company is highly regulated, then there might be an issue of investigation by regulators. And also the company itself might want to do some internal investigation. So they would expect lawyers to help them out in dealing with third-party service providers, like, for example, forensic experts in trying to come in to do the investigation and to maintain maybe legal professional privilege in terms of any future possible claims from other stakeholders, customers, or regulators. And also maybe if the company wants to try to get the help from the police, like in Hong Kong, we have the police that have a unit on cybersecurity and technology crime. And there have also been cases, like I read from the news, that even on the, I think the oil pipeline case, where I think there was reported that ransomware was paid, but the FBI was able to retrieve some of the Bitcoins. So if you're able to want to deal with the police, then lawyers might be expected to help them out, help the client to also liaise and deal with the police and to deal with any possible investigations. So I think these are the things that the role as a lawyer might come in either in-house or outside counsel to help the company and deal with parties. Thank you.
So my thoughts are that as lawyers, when we step in, from my experience, depends on, first of all, are we dealing with a client that has an existing counsel that is actually assisting with the investigation of the incident. On the other side, it will be you're dealing with a maybe not so sophisticated client who has absolutely no idea what to do, and then you have to handhold him from step one all the way to post-breach matters. So generally, what I would do is I would say that you are expected to, at the very least, guide the client, not just in terms of handling internally the chaos that's happening, in terms of finding out where is the breach, what is the consequences, who are the affected individuals, but also in terms of the obligations that the company has to take, especially if you're talking about a company in a regulated industry. So whether is it notifying the data protection regulator, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or if necessary, the affected individuals. I think these are steps that you have to lay out clearly and, more importantly, fast, because this is a time-sensitive matter and you need to contain the incidents as fast as you can. So subsequently, I guess other expectations will be in terms of liaising with the affected business unit or the business unit that was involved. You need to find out exactly what happened, because you then, as a lawyer, have to actually prepare the responses to the data protection regulator. You have to prepare the responses to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, because you have to make sure that all these are consistent. So this is especially important if you're talking about a multi-jurisdictional incident. So that is where I've seen cases where you actually have to liaise with not just the headquarters in Singapore, but also the various offices in the different Southeast Asian countries, and come together to actually project a unified response to the different regulators in the different countries. That is very important because that is your role. Maybe the counsel in the headquarters wouldn't be able to see that, but as a lawyer, expected to basically manage the whole incidents to make sure that at the end of the day, the outcome is as good as possible, at least for the company itself.
Yeah,
just
and
one more point to add. Sorry, I think also it depends on the kind of companies. I mean, if the company is a public company, and if it's also, say, doing online business, and the ransomware attack has actually affected the business of the company, then as a listed company, that might lead to a obligation to actually make a public announcement to disclose. So lawyers might need to come in to consider how much to disclose, whether that should be said or that should not be said. So these kind of things would obviously you need legal advice.
Definitely. I think Dominic perfectly covered what I was just about to say, which is, the expectation in relation to the affected individuals as a result of the breach as well. I think that's where the value add comes in, where the lawyers and maybe your PR or your investor relations teams actually need to work together to ensure there's consistency, and whatever response you give is able to withstand either investigations or public outcry, and potentially a defense in the future as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I think this is also a really great segue to the next point that we're going to talk about in terms of the risks that are brought about by digital transformations. So maybe we start with Zhen Guang this time. Do you agree that companies are exposed to greater risks as they pivot into the digital age? Or are the risk levels more or less the same? It's just simply the type of risks that has changed.
That's a good question. Personally, I definitely agree that the companies are exposed to greater risks in this digital age because of the increase in the type of risk arising from such digital transformation initiatives. So maybe to spell out some examples would be one risk area is on technology, where there's a potential for losses due to technology failures, or where the technology-related risks have an impact on the system and the processes as well as the affected individuals. So for the key risk area for technology would be, say, the compatibility and accuracy of the functionality of the implemented technology. So another side would be cyber. So it is similar but fairly distinct, because for cyber, it's basically to ensure the protection of the digital environment from unauthorized access usage and ensuring confidentiality and the integrity of the internal system. So key controls would be the network architecture, application security, and security monitoring. So we also have, of course, the privacy risk concerns, data protection, where the risks arise due to, say, improper handling of personal data of customers and employees, which may impact the privacy of these affected individuals. So the key controls I see for this will be generally the general privacy principles such as consent, notice, choice. Then also another one, especially for companies in regulated sectors, there's a risk of non-compliance with the statutory requirements, including technology laws and sectorial regulations. So this could include, say, the e-communications and transactions regulatory regulations, which not only apply to perhaps many, but you also would have industry-specific regulation. So in Singapore, for example, we have the Monetary Authority of Singapore Technology Risk Management Guidelines. We also have the MAS outsourcing guidelines, which applies to basically all institutions that are regulated by the MAS. So overall, these are just some of the examples of the types of risks that I see. Some may be unique, but the majority of them, they're not unique to any one industry, and they apply across to most, if not all.
Dominic, what about your thoughts on the same question?
Yeah, I totally agree with Zheng Guang that there are increasing types of risks arising from digital transformation initiatives because of the way that devices are interconnected and also data transferred and stored with ever higher speed, like 5G, and a lot of digital online banking and digital payment transactions more and more. So actually that leads me to maybe just very briefly talk about Hong Kong in terms of phishing frauds. Actually, that relates to banks have increased a lot. According to the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the number of cases in terms of suspicious websites, mobile applications, and phishing SMS and emails in the first 6 months of 2021 have been increased by 145%. And there have been involving aggregate amount of $22 million of loss compared to no such reported case in 2020. So the HKMA has actually, and also the Hong Kong Association of Banks, issued some warnings and guidance on how to protect your personal digital keys and beware of fraudulent links, because people nowadays use a lot of online bankings on their mobile devices, and the criminals just send you a message and ask you for accessing an embedded link to try to actually grab or catch your password and also one-time password, because you have two-factor authentication, so they will be able to also capture the OTPs. So actually that's very difficult to prevent, because generally a lot of people, they see a message that they thought that is from a bank, and then they will just click it because they thought that it's really from the reputable banks. So that is why there have been so many cases where people online banking account actually has been hacked and money stolen from there. So this is all leads back to the matter of risk in terms of, because of a lot of online digital transactions and payments. So I think the lesson to learn is that for companies, they must go back to their own policies and actually the training, and make sure that those policies are followed, and actually maybe that kind of training would actually needs to be carried out and not just be something that's written there, but no one is reading that.
I think I've seen a number of really interesting questions that came out as a result of this issue. So maybe let me take it in turn, especially because Dominic has also nicely segued again into one of the questions. So law firms, which often have access to highly privileged and confidential information, are also themselves subjected to cybersecurity threats. And there's often this allegation that lawyers are slow adopters of technology. So how ready are law firms today, in your respective opinions, with dealing with such threats?
I think that's a very good question, and it's a challenge, I think, for the smaller firms, because they might not have the knowledge or even the resources to deal with this kind of matter, but this is a real threat. And there have been cases actually in Hong Kong where I think the law firms have been hacked, in the sense that then someone pretends to be the lawyers and contacted the clients and asked them to pay the balance of the purchase money of the property to the crooks. So that happened actually. So it's quite difficult to prevent, but still I think there's the obligation and responsibility on the law firms, because we are fiduciaries, and we have the obligation, of course, under I'm sure local professional conduct rules, and also the law, to make sure that in terms of dealing with these kind of things, we need to be diligent and ensure that where practically possible, all the security measures. So that's I think law firms can't avoid that, and so we just need to be vigilant and just to be careful.
Zheng Guang, anything to add?
Thanks, Sumei. Thanks, Dom. I guess what we can see is that we do appreciate that the legal profession is very established and is a profession that's been around for a long time. So in that sense, naturally, they even before the pandemic, to actually migrate from your notes, your hard copy notes to soft copy, some law firms may struggle to do so, especially for those who, let's say, are the sole proprietors or those who maybe don't have the proper infrastructure to do so. So what I see is that this question is something that very helpfully is something that the Law Society of Singapore here, at least I'm aware that they recognize such a situation. So in that sense, in dealing with such, let's say, cybersecurity measures or threats, what the Law Society have done is to actually reach out and encourage law firms to not only build up their internal infrastructure digitally, but also in terms of actually laying out roadmaps, laying out what they expect of law firms going forward into dealing with such cybersecurity threats. I think especially so this was accelerated at the start of last year when COVID started. So in that sense, it's a silver lining because now if you were to actually come to a law firm, you will naturally feel that most of the, let's say, matters are now in the system, the digital system. You also realize that law firms practice bring your own device, or in that sense, making sure that the data of the law firm is actually separate from, let's say, personal devices, or even so, if it's on the personal device, there is a VPN in place or an application in place to ensure there is a breach, there's a gap between personal data of the user as well as business data. So how I see is that it's not something that can happen in a matter of a year, but this is something that you can see law firms are actually taking the baby steps, or if they're in the later stage, the advanced steps to ensure that, hey, we are ready going forward to deal with such threats themselves.
I think that gives the external facing clients or the external clients of law firms some comfort.
I think for some law firms, actually, when they really need to deal with really highly confidential and privileged matters, they just go back to the old school way of seeing each other in person, and all mobile phones are checked out before they go into the meeting rooms.
Yeah, I think there are technology is both the panacea and the pain sometimes, isn't it? I mean, again, then this dives into our next question perfectly because, in performing due diligence on big third-party service providers, so we're talking about the Googles and the Amazons and the AWSs of the world, most of us, when we perform such internal due diligence that is expected of us as companies, we only get very generic answers in return. So are there any suggestions from either of you in terms of how we are supposed to manage this risk if our third-party service providers are only providing us generic responses? Or put it another way, if we engage a lawyer, will they be able to get us better responses?
So how I see, sure. I think the starting point is we're talking about a big third-party service provider. So let's say AWS, Google, Apple, and then you want to perform due diligence because of the services that you are going to engage these service providers for. So I think the starting point or I guess most of us recognize, is that the unequal bargaining power. I think that's the starting point. There's a commercial reality that you cannot avoid as much as you want to. So I think that's a starting point. And the other thing that you need to also be aware of is, yes, these giants, they refuse to release more information than necessary, or they only release limited information that is not up to your satisfaction. So what do you do next? So I think we have to be aware that we are not talking about unregulated giants who just run the place like the Wild Wild West. No, you have to realize that, say, for example, these tech giants, they could be governed by the GDPR, for example. So you know that, naturally speaking, these giants would have to have in place certain obligations because these are required by law, by the GDPR, for example. So this gives you the comfort because okay, I may not get the necessary information that I want from, let's say, a certain big third-party service provider, But I know that he's based in Europe. I know that he's governed by the GDPR when we are dealing with personal data. So I know that there's at least certain standard that he has already met, because, and in that sense, the regulator in Europe will be coming after that service provider if anything happens. So these are the reassurance that I guess you can actually work around in dealing with not getting the answers that you require.
Yeah, very well said by Zheng Guan, and I think that's really the commercial reality. But in terms of, if we talk about the big service providers, I also share the same view as Zheng Guan, that maybe we don't need to be too worried about that. But of course, there's never any, of course, guarantee. And I'm not sure whether by getting a lawyer would get any further than the generic answers. But of course, one can try. But still, I think that's not easy to get more than that. But I'm not sure. I mean, maybe there are other maybe third-party kind of ratings and vetting kind of reports that one can also try to get to supplement any if there are really any concerns on the use of any particular products, or maybe you want to use a cloud service and then you're really not sure whether they're putting anything in any particular place, let's say, whether you have any concern, maybe then you can try to get certain specific questions and see how they answer.
Yeah, I think it's also balanced against, if them being such large players, then they cannot be personalizing or tailoring responses to each and every person who signs up to their services as well.
Or maybe they don't know how to answer because it's on the cloud. They don't even know any particular bits and pieces are stored.
Exactly. And then also, I mean, of course, we have to balance that against the risks that, sometimes the products that we sign on with these large giants are, really cutting edge. So there may not even be legislation yet on that particular area. It's still something that's largely unregulated because it's so cutting edge, and the law does take some time to catch up. So I mean, there is going to be that little bit of gap. And since we are talking about giants, so that dives very nicely as well into our next topic of, we talked about monitoring of potential use of, either your employees or your users' use of data in order, to maybe address potential security risks, or to maybe even, identify existing gaps, or even, to use the data for product development, or even to identify new segments and opportunities in your market. So, Dominic, do you think that there's anything companies should be aware of when they are planning to collect and use personal data of customers or employees in this way?
I think the concern may be, or be something that needs to be aware is over collection of data, because actually nowadays it's not difficult to collect a lot of data, and including biometric data like facial recognition, that kind of data. But the thing is, even in places like mainland China, they're very worried about this. I think the recent Shenzhen government, they have released a draft law in terms of prohibiting business from conducting extensive personal data collection. And actually, I think there's a initiative to say that companies should not force customers on the apps to use mandatory facial recognition, because they do know that by way of actually, because of big data and analysis and algorithmic kind of analysis, that they might actually give an unfair advantage on certain companies. So that might actually be an issue of infringing anti-competition law and also discrimination. So I think even for Shenzhen, the new law is saying that you shouldn't force people to provide you with personal data, and then they actually say that natural persons have personal rights and interests in their personal data, and particularly their apps are banned from profiling users under the age of 18, and to serve them with personalized recommendations. Of course, we know that these things happen, of all this push kind of notifications and advertisements, but of course, that might also be kind of discrimination. and also giving those who are able to deal with or collect all these personal data an unfair advantage. So in terms of general companies, of course, if you are not onto online, still there might be a risk that if you collect too much, of course, you might want to use that for business analysis or whatever, but still, what if you actually collect too much and then you forgot about it? There have been cases in Hong Kong where actually you collect so much data, but some of them you don't reuse it and just put it away. And then, but somehow, sometime later, it got lost, and then you are being pursued for data leakage or personal data. But actually, you haven't used those data. You just forgot about it. You just collect them. So and you didn't even encrypt them. So sometimes, companies and people do that. They just try to get everything first, and maybe they would think of some use of that. But in terms of personal data, particularly personal data, that's really something that companies should be really careful of not over collecting.
Yeah, I think the collection and subsequent retention of the data is definitely a big issue. Zhen Guang, what about your views on this matter?
So I think another issue that the company should take note of when collecting and using is the basis upon such collection and use is based upon. So what I mean is, for example, in most countries, consent will be the basis for the collection and the use. You also need to be aware of the exceptions to the collection and use without consent. So in Southeast Asia, different countries might have different legal basis for the collection and use. In Singapore, generally speaking, consent is the only basis. So to put it simply, consent is king here. But recently there has been some amendments to the PDPA. So for example, some of the changes that were introduced would be the deemed consent by notification. We also have the legitimate interest exceptions. So what I see is some of the common potential pitfalls arising from this amendment will be that companies, in their eager to actually take advantage of these new amendments, so instead of actually collecting actual consent, they might say, okay, let's go by deemed consent by notification instead. Let's rely on the legitimate interest exception because it's just too much of a hassle to collect actual consent because of the business operation. So something that I guess you have to take note of is that sometimes it might actually be easier to obtain the express consent in the first place instead of relying on these new exceptions or deemed consent. And the reason why I say so is because for the legitimate interest exception and the deemed consent by notification, for example, the company needs to conduct risk assessments. So this is something that is like a checklist. And then you have to ask yourself, do I really need to go through this checklist every time? Or is it simpler to actually collect the express consent at the outset? Because once you collect it, then it's easier that way, as long as you make sure that you properly record it. So these are some of the one example where I see companies, they have to be familiar with the basis that they're actually collecting and using the personal data for, because at the end of the day, when it comes to an investigation or when it just comes to an internal audit within the company, then all this will trickle down and will snowball, which might pose a problem later on.
Perfect. We are close to the end of the hour, so I'm just going to ask our panelists one last burning question and then nicely round out this very interesting discussion that we had. So, our privacy and data protection issues have gotten a lot of publicity in the last couple of years. How has this changing public sentiment towards privacy affected your work in your respective regions? Perhaps, Zhen Guang, you want to start?
Sure, Sumei. Certainly, there's been a lot of publicity, a lot of attention, or at least focus by individuals of their data protection rights, at least in Singapore. So on average, I can see that there are roughly 10 cases of enforcement decisions published on the regulator website each time, every time there's a publication. And the majority of these cases are on the breach of the protection obligation. But there are also other interesting decisions that have recently come up. I won't go into details in them, but one of them will be a data subject access request that was rejected. It was an individual and HSBC Bank. where HSBC rejected the data subject access request because it was of the view that the redacted data that the individual was asking for, that was opinion data, and it believed that it fell under an evaluative purpose exception under the PDPA. So I think another case that has come to a lot of attention is the individual's right of private action. So what I mean is that under the PDPA, an individual actually has the right to seek relief in civil proceedings if they believe they suffer a loss or damage as a result of a data protection obligation infringement by the organization. So there's a recent Singapore High Court case. I believe it's Alex Bellingham and Michael Reed. But basically that case essentially comprises of a matter where the individual was trying to claim against the individual B because individual B had used his personal email address without his consent. And so the individual A was trying to claim losses for that. So I believe in that decision, the court felt that there was no proof of loss. A mere loss of control over personal data wasn't regarded as the loss that was necessary to give rise to a private action. So that's for Singapore. So what I see is that this has certainly, I guess, impacted on my work matters. I see an increase in the number of companies reviewing their data protection documentation. They want to make sure that their documentation are robust enough to actually withstand such complaints, such investigations by the PDPC when the time hopefully does not come. So these are some of the, I guess, implications, not just from the new amendments to the PDPA, but also in terms of the increased awareness of individuals' data protection rights under the PDPA.
And for my part, because of the time, just very briefly, I think the hot topic recently is on the proposed amendments to give more power and sanctioning power to the Privacy Commission in Hong Kong to deal with doxing. Now, doxing means generally that the exposure of personal information and private information collected from internet to expose that to in order to hurt some person. Now, there have been a lot of cases due to what happened in Hong Kong in 2019. So there have been some proposal to grant more powers to the Privacy Commissioner, and one of the powers is to take down these kind of posted messages from internet service providers or social media. And there have been some concerns from all these big social media giants saying that, oh, if that might mean that our staff could commit a crime if they don't really follow the directions of the Privacy Commissioner, then they might rather not operate here. But there seems to be some discussion going on. Maybe the actual law when it comes out is not really that strict. Maybe there's some provisions or opt-out situation. So I think that's the issue, because people are more aware of the situation, and of course a lot of cases where people, even that when they don't use social media, their privacy might be affected because other people are posting your photos and your data. So I guess it's something that is rising out of people's concern of their own privacy. And also, apart from that, in terms of the Hong Kong privacy law, we are lagging behind in terms of sanction and deterrence. So there have also been suggestions to increase the powers and things like mandatory notification that's kind of like aligned to GDPR. So I think that's the situation in Hong Kong. So going forward, maybe there will be even more cases in terms of privacy protection and this area. Thank you.
All right. On that very interesting note, I'll have to bring this discussion to a close. Thank you, Dominic and Zhen Guang, for this engaging discussion, and a big thank you to our attendees for your participation as well.